Welcome back to the channel. Today we dive into one of the boldest and most unbelievable comebacks in history, the moment a fallen emperor escaped exile and marched back to power against all odds. From defeat and isolation to ambition and daring, this is the story of how everything changed in just a matter of weeks. If you enjoy deep dive history content like this, make sure to like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more stories that bring the past to life. Now let's begin. Imagine ruling almost all of Europe, commanding vast armies that stretched beyond the horizon, and watching kings tremble at the mere mention of your name, only to find yourself suddenly stripped of power, isolated, and confined to a tiny island in the Mediterranean Sea. This dramatic reversal of fortune defined one of the most astonishing turning points in history, and at its center stood a man whose ambition had reshaped the political landscape of an entire continent. For years he had marched across Europe, defeating coalition after coalition, redrawing borders, and placing allies and family members on foreign thrones. His soldiers believed him invincible, his enemies feared him, and ordinary citizens across Europe either admired him as a modernizing force or despised him as a relentless conqueror. Yet even the most powerful figures in history eventually face a moment when their empire begins to crack, and for this emperor, that moment arrived after a string of catastrophic decisions, culminating in military disaster, political betrayal, and exhaustion from nearly constant war. The once unified support of his allies began to erode, and nations that had previously bowed to his authority started to resist. His armies, though still formidable, were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been, and losses in men, supplies, and morale began to mount. The turning point came after his ambitious campaign deep into Eastern Europe, where distance, harsh climate, and determined resistance destroyed the strength of his military machine. When his battered forces returned, the illusion of invincibility had shattered, and his enemies seized the opportunity. Coalition armies from multiple nations gathered, determined to end his dominance once and for all, and as they advanced, battles were fought across Europe in a desperate struggle that would decide the fate of the continent. His generals fought bravely, and he himself continued to demonstrate remarkable tactical brilliance, but the scale of opposition was simply too great. Gradually, territory after territory slipped from his control, allies defected, and the pressure tightened around him. The decisive blow came when enemy forces approached the capital, threatening the very heart of his empire. Inside the city, political leaders debated the future, while outside, the once feared emperor faced the grim reality that his reign might be ending. Faced with overwhelming odds, his supporters dwindling, and his own marshals urging him to step aside to preserve what remained, he made the painful decision to abdicate. It was an extraordinary moment. A man who had risen from relatively modest origins to crown himself emperor, now relinquishing power under pressure from enemies and former allies alike. Europe's monarchs, who had fought him for years, now faced a dilemma. They feared his influence and charisma, but they also recognized that executing him might turn him into a martyr and ignite further unrest. Imprisoning him in a distant fortress might seem safer, yet it risked creating a symbol of resistance for his followers. Ultimately, they chose a solution that seemed both merciful and practical: exile. He would be removed from the center of power and sent far away from the political stage to a place where he could no longer interfere in continental affairs. The location selected was the island of Elba, a small, rugged piece of land off the coast of Italy. Compared to the vast territories he once governed, Elba was insignificant, barely visible on many maps, with a modest population and limited resources. To the victorious powers, it seemed impossible that a man who had commanded millions could threaten Europe from such a tiny base. They allowed him a small personal guard, a title, and even a measure of ceremonial respect, believing that the distance and scale of his confinement would ensure that his era was truly over. For the emperor himself, however, the exile represented something deeper than defeat. It was a moment of reflection, humiliation, and uncertainty. He had gone from directing campaigns that shaped continents to ruling a tiny island with only a handful of followers. The contrast was staggering. Yet those who knew him understood that he was not a man easily broken. Throughout his life he had thrived on adversity, using setbacks as fuel for ambition. Even in exile, his mind remained active, analyzing the political situation in Europe, listening to reports from France, and considering the possibilities that might still exist. Meanwhile, across the continent, the political landscape was shifting. The monarchy restored in his former realm struggled to regain stability. Many soldiers who had fought under him felt a lingering loyalty, remembering the victories and the glory of earlier campaigns. Ordinary citizens, who had grown accustomed to the reforms introduced during his rule, now faced uncertainty under the returning royal government. Economic difficulties and political tensions created an atmosphere of dissatisfaction. While the rulers of Europe congratulated themselves on ending years of conflict, the peace they established was fragile, and beneath the surface, old divisions and new grievances simmered. The exiled emperor observed these developments with keen interest. Though separated from power, he remained connected through correspondence, visitors, and news brought by ships arriving at the island. Every report reinforced the idea that his story might not yet be finished. The victors, confident in their decision, paid little attention to the possibility that the man they had exiled could once again become a threat. They underestimated his determination, his influence, and the loyalty he inspired. To them, he was a fallen ruler, a chapter closed. To him, exile was not necessarily an end, but perhaps a pause, a moment between acts in a drama that had not yet reached its conclusion. On Elba, he adopted the outward appearance of a ruler adapting to retirement. He reviewed troops, reorganized administration, and took interest in local matters, giving the impression that he had accepted his fate. Yet behind this calm exterior, his mind continued to race with possibilities. He remembered how quickly fortune could change, how unexpected opportunities could arise, and how the loyalty of soldiers could shift the balance of power. The contrast between his diminished circumstances and his enduring ambition created a tension that defined this period of his life. He was no longer the master of Europe, yet he had not abandoned the identity that had driven him to greatness. Observers who visited him sometimes remarked on his composure, while others sensed the restless energy beneath the surface. The small island, though peaceful compared to the battlefields of his past, could not contain the scale of his ambitions. Every day in exile served as a reminder of what he had lost and what he might attempt to regain. As months passed, rumors circulated across Europe about his intentions. Some dismissed them as idle speculation, believing that the era of his dominance was finished. Others worried that his presence, even in exile, remained dangerous. But the majority of leaders, preoccupied with their own diplomatic negotiations and territorial arrangements, chose to believe that the problem had been solved. This miscalculation would prove significant, because history has often shown that underestimating a determined leader can have dramatic consequences. The fall of the emperor, therefore, was not simply a moment of defeat, it was the beginning of one of the most extraordinary episodes in modern history. From the heights of power to the isolation of exile, the transformation seemed complete, yet the story was far from over. The world believed that the man who had once dominated Europe was finished, confined to a small island with little chance of influencing events again. But ambition, reputation, and opportunity would soon combine in ways that no one fully anticipated, setting the stage for a daring move that would astonish both supporters and enemies alike. Exile on a small island might have broken many leaders, but for this former emperor it became a strange and unsettling mixture of limitation and opportunity. When he first arrived, the contrast between his past and present circumstances was impossible to ignore. Only months earlier he had directed armies across continents, issued decrees that reshaped nations, and presided over ceremonies that symbolized his unmatched authority. Now he found himself on a rugged island with a modest population, a handful of loyal followers, and a future that appeared uncertain. The island itself, though picturesque in places, was small enough that a determined rider could cross much of it in a day. Its hills, coastal villages, and scattered farms formed a landscape far removed from the grandeur of imperial capitals. Yet rather than retreat into bitterness or despair, he began to study his surroundings with the same analytical focus he had once applied to battlefields. He examined the island's roads, its defenses, its resources, and its administration, treating it as a miniature realm that could be organized and improved. This approach surprised many observers, who had expected him to withdraw into private life. Instead, he acted with deliberate purpose, as though even in exile he intended to demonstrate his capacity for leadership. He inspected local fortifications, reviewed the small force assigned to him, and issued instructions aimed at improving efficiency. To outsiders, these actions might have seemed unnecessary for such a small territory, but they reflected his inability to remain idle. He had always been a man driven by activity, and inactivity, more than defeat, was what he feared most. As he walked through villages, spoke with inhabitants, and supervised projects, he projected the image of a ruler still engaged in governance. This behavior had a psychological effect not only on the island's population but also on his own supporters. They saw that he had not abandoned his sense of identity, and that even reduced circumstances could not diminish his determination to organize, plan, and lead. He ordered improvements to roads that connected different parts of the island, recognizing that better infrastructure would facilitate movement and communication. He took interest in agriculture, mining, and trade, discussing possibilities for increasing productivity. These efforts were modest compared to the scale of his former empire, but they allowed him to maintain a routine and demonstrate that his administrative abilities remained intact. Visitors who came to the island often remarked on his energy. They expected a defeated ruler resigned to obscurity, yet they encountered someone actively engaged in daily affairs, discussing policies, reviewing reports, and considering reforms. This contrast contributed to the growing sense that exile had not extinguished his ambition. Meanwhile, his personal routine reflected a disciplined structure. He rose early, read reports, dictated correspondence, and held meetings with advisors. Even in a limited setting, he recreated elements of the courtly atmosphere that had surrounded him in power. Uniforms, ceremonies, and formalities were preserved, reinforcing the impression that he still regarded himself as more than a private citizen. His small guard, composed of loyal veterans, remained devoted to him. Many of these men had followed him through years of campaigns, sharing victories and defeats, and their loyalty provided emotional support as well as practical security. Their presence reminded him of the bonds forged in earlier struggles, and their continued devotion reinforced his belief that he still commanded respect. At the same time, he kept a close watch on developments beyond the island. Ships arriving from the mainland brought news, letters, and rumors. He listened carefully to accounts of political changes, economic difficulties, and public sentiment in his former realm. Reports indicated that the restored monarchy faced challenges. Many soldiers, disbanded or reassigned, felt uncertain about their future. Some missed the sense of purpose and recognition they had enjoyed under his leadership. Others resented the return of aristocratic privileges that had been curtailed during his rule. Citizens who had benefited from administrative reforms worried about losing gains in law, education, and social mobility. These developments did not necessarily guarantee support for a return, but they suggested that dissatisfaction existed. He analyzed each report, comparing them, questioning their accuracy, and searching for patterns. This analytical approach mirrored the way he had once evaluated intelligence before battles. He understood that information could be incomplete or biased, so he sought multiple sources. Visitors, travelers, and former officials provided different perspectives. Through these conversations, he gradually built a picture of a nation unsettled by transition. The monarchy attempted to restore traditions and authority, but the process created tensions. Some welcomed stability, while others felt alienated. Economic issues added to the uncertainty, as the aftermath of years of war affected trade, employment, and finances. For the exiled leader, these developments were significant. They suggested that the political situation remained fluid and that opportunities might arise. Yet he also recognized the risks. Any attempt to return would require not only boldness but also favorable conditions. He needed to gauge whether loyalty still existed among soldiers, whether citizens might support him, and whether foreign powers were united or divided. His reflections often extended into long conversations with close advisors. They debated possibilities, weighed obstacles, and considered scenarios. While some urged caution, others hinted that history might not yet be finished. These discussions, though speculative, kept alive the idea that exile might not be permanent. On the island, daily life continued. He attended to administrative matters, reviewed construction projects, and occasionally participated in social gatherings. He walked along the coastline, observed ships passing in the distance, and reflected on the broader world beyond his immediate surroundings. The sight of the sea carried symbolic meaning. It separated him from his former empire, yet it also represented a pathway, a reminder that movement was possible. The island's population gradually grew accustomed to his presence. Some admired his energy and courtesy, while others viewed him with curiosity. He interacted with local leaders, listened to their concerns, and offered solutions. These interactions reinforced his image as a capable administrator. However, beneath the surface, his mind remained focused on larger questions. He knew that time could either diminish his influence or create new opportunities. Each passing month brought changes in Europe. Diplomatic negotiations among the victorious powers shaped borders and alliances. Differences of opinion emerged, and rivalries persisted. Though the leaders publicly celebrated peace, underlying tensions hinted that unity might not last. From exile, he observed these dynamics with interest. He understood that divisions among opponents could create openings. His own situation, though constrained, allowed him to think strategically without the immediate pressures of war. Some observers later suggested that this period of exile functioned as a time of planning. Whether or not detailed plans existed, it is clear that he did not abandon the possibility of action. His correspondence reflected curiosity about military dispositions, political sentiment, and economic conditions. He sought to remain informed, believing that knowledge was essential for any future decision. Meanwhile, the small court he maintained preserved a sense of continuity. Advisors, officers, and attendants followed routines reminiscent of earlier days. Meals, discussions, and ceremonies created an atmosphere that contrasted with the island's modest scale. This environment helped sustain morale among his followers and reinforced his own sense of identity. He often spoke about past campaigns, analyzing decisions and outcomes. These reflections were not merely nostalgic, they served as lessons, reinforcing principles he might apply again. He considered the importance of speed, surprise, and morale, qualities that had defined his earlier successes. At times he also acknowledged mistakes, recognizing that overextension and miscalculation had contributed to his fall. These moments of introspection added complexity to his character, revealing a leader capable of self-evaluation. Yet even as he reflected, he remained outwardly composed. Visitors sometimes remarked that he appeared calm, even content, but those who observed closely noticed the restless energy beneath the surface. He was not a man suited to quiet retirement. The island, though peaceful, felt too small for his ambitions. Each day of routine carried an undercurrent of anticipation. Reports from the mainland suggested that dissatisfaction persisted. Soldiers remembered their former commander. Citizens debated the direction of the government. Economic challenges continued. These developments, combined with his own determination, gradually shaped a mindset in which the idea of return became conceivable. The leaders of Europe, meanwhile, grew complacent. They believed that exile had solved the problem. Their focus shifted to diplomatic arrangements, territorial adjustments, and internal concerns. Few considered the possibility that the man on the island might attempt something bold. This underestimation would prove critical. The exiled emperor, though limited in resources, possessed qualities that had defined his rise: confidence, decisiveness, and the ability to inspire loyalty. As weeks turned into months, the contrast between his outward acceptance of exile and his inner calculation became more pronounced. He continued to govern the island efficiently, maintaining order and improvement, yet his thoughts increasingly extended beyond its shores. The calm routine masked a growing sense that the story was not finished. History often turns on moments when preparation meets opportunity, and during this period, preparation quietly took shape. By early 1815, the situation on the island had settled into a rhythm that seemed calm on the surface, yet beneath that calm a bold idea was slowly forming. Months of observation, conversations, and reports had convinced the exiled emperor that conditions beyond the island were unstable. Dissatisfaction in his former realm had not disappeared, and the political settlement imposed by the victorious powers appeared fragile. He understood that time worked against him, because the longer he remained inactive, the more the new order would solidify and the more his influence would fade. At the same time, he knew that any attempt to return would require speed, secrecy, and a willingness to risk everything. The plan that began to take shape was audacious to the point of recklessness. With only a small force, limited ships, and uncertain support, he would leave the island, sail across waters patrolled by hostile fleets, land on the mainland, and attempt to rally the nation to his cause. Failure would mean capture or death. Success, though unlikely, would restore him to power. The decision was not made impulsively. He weighed the risks carefully, discussing possibilities with trusted advisors and loyal officers. Some cautioned against such a dangerous gamble, arguing that the odds were too great and that the consequences of failure would be severe. Others, inspired by his confidence, believed that boldness had always been his greatest strength and that hesitation would guarantee obscurity. These debates reflected the tension between caution and ambition. Ultimately, his character favored action. He had built his career on daring moves, and the prospect of remaining quietly in exile seemed more intolerable than the dangers of escape. Preparations began quietly, without drawing attention. Ships were inspected, supplies gathered, and loyal troops informed only when necessary. The small flotilla available to him consisted of a few vessels, hardly enough for a large-scale operation. Yet he did not require a large force. His strategy depended not on overwhelming numbers, but on the psychological impact of his return. He believed that once he set foot on the mainland, his reputation and the lingering loyalty of soldiers would compensate for his limited resources. Timing was critical. He needed to depart when surveillance was least effective and when weather conditions favored a quick crossing. He also needed to ensure that news of his departure would not reach opponents too quickly. Secrecy became essential. Even among his followers, details were shared carefully. The night chosen for departure approached and tension grew. The risk was enormous, but the opportunity seemed unique. On the evening of February 26, 1815, the moment arrived. Under cover of darkness, preparations accelerated. Soldiers assembled quietly, equipment was loaded, and the small fleet prepared to sail. The sea, which had long represented separation, now became the path to possibility. As the ships left the harbor, those on board understood that they were embarking on a venture that could alter history. The exiled emperor stood among them, calm yet focused, aware that every hour ahead would determine success or failure. The crossing itself carried significant danger. British naval patrols monitored the waters, and discovery would have ended the attempt immediately. The ships moved cautiously, avoiding attention and relying on speed. Weather conditions were favorable, and the journey progressed without interception. During the voyage, he addressed his men, reminding them of past victories and appealing to their loyalty. Many of them were veterans who had followed him through earlier campaigns, and their devotion remained strong. Their confidence in him reinforced the belief that the gamble might succeed. Days later, the coastline of southern France appeared on the horizon. The site marked the transition from exile to action. The landing site chosen was near Cannes, a relatively quiet stretch of coast where resistance was unlikely at first. On March 1, 1815, the ships reached shore, and troops disembarked. The moment carried symbolic weight. He had left exile behind and stepped once more onto the soil of his former empire. Yet the challenge had only begun. His force numbered roughly 1,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and a few artillery pieces. Against the full strength of the restored government, this was insignificant, but his strategy depended on movement and persuasion rather than direct confrontation. He planned to march inland, heading toward the capital, and rely on encounters with soldiers and civilians to build support. The route he chose avoided major royalist strongholds and instead passed through regions where loyalty might be more favorable. As the column advanced, villagers watched with curiosity. Some recognized him immediately, while others struggled to believe that the exiled ruler had returned. News spread rapidly, carried by travelers and local residents. Each step increased the tension. Royal authorities, alerted to his landing, began organizing troops to intercept him. Orders were issued to stop the advancing column before it could gain momentum. The situation appeared precarious. A single determined force could have ended the attempt. Yet he pressed forward with confidence. His demeanor projected assurance, as though he believed success was inevitable. This confidence influenced his followers, who marched with renewed determination. Along the route, he issued proclamations appealing to soldiers and citizens. He emphasized reconciliation, promising stability and reform. These messages were designed to reduce fear and encourage support. Meanwhile, royal troops moved to confront him. The first significant encounter approached near Grenoble. The confrontation carried enormous significance. If the troops remained loyal to the monarchy and opened fire, the small advancing force would likely be destroyed. But he prepared for a different outcome. Instead of arranging a traditional battle formation, he planned a dramatic gesture. As the two sides approached, tension filled the air. Soldiers on both sides recognized the stakes. He moved forward, separating himself from his guards, and addressed the opposing troops directly. His words, simple yet powerful, appealed to their memories and loyalty. He reminded them of past campaigns, victories, and shared identity. By placing himself within range and inviting them to act, he transformed the moment into a test of allegiance. The soldiers hesitated. The dramatic pause that followed became legendary. Instead of firing, voices began to rise. Recognition spread, followed by cheers. The line between opposing forces dissolved as soldiers moved toward him. The confrontation ended without violence. This outcome confirmed the effectiveness of his strategy. Loyalty and reputation had overcome orders and fear. His force grew as more soldiers joined. The psychological impact was enormous. News of the encounter spread quickly, encouraging others to reconsider their position. As he continued his march, additional units switched sides. Each defection strengthened his position and weakened the government. The momentum became self-reinforcing. Civilians gathered along the roads, some cheering, others observing cautiously. The sense of inevitability increased. Royal authorities, alarmed by the rapid shift, struggled to organize resistance. Commanders faced uncertainty about the loyalty of their own troops. This hesitation allowed the advancing column to move forward with minimal opposition. The journey northward became a remarkable sequence of persuasion rather than combat. Each day brought new supporters, additional troops, and growing confidence. The gamble that had begun with a small force now evolved into a movement. The former exile, once confined to a tiny island, now marched through the countryside, rebuilding power step by step. The daring escape had succeeded in its first and most dangerous phase. He had crossed the sea, landed on the mainland, and begun to transform a risky venture into a dramatic return. The momentum generated during these early days would shape the events that followed, demonstrating that boldness, timing, and psychological insight could overcome overwhelming odds. As the advancing column moved deeper into the countryside, the atmosphere surrounding the march began to change from uncertainty to cautious excitement. What had started as a risky return with only a small group of loyal followers was gradually becoming something larger, something more unpredictable. Villages that had initially watched in silence now greeted the marchers with curiosity, and curiosity slowly transformed into recognition. People whispered his name, recalling stories of earlier victories, reforms, and the sense of national pride associated with his rule. The psychological dimension of the campaign was becoming increasingly important. He understood that every interaction mattered, that every encounter with civilians and soldiers could shift momentum. His approach relied not on force but on persuasion, confidence, and symbolism. The first dramatic confrontation had already demonstrated that loyalty among soldiers could outweigh formal orders. This realization strengthened his belief that he could continue advancing without major battles. As his force approached new towns, he ensured that proclamations were distributed, emphasizing unity, stability, and a promise to avoid revenge. These messages were carefully crafted to reduce fear among those who might otherwise resist. He knew that many officials and officers had sworn allegiance to the restored monarchy, and he wanted to avoid forcing them into immediate opposition. By presenting himself as a figure of reconciliation rather than confrontation, he increased the chances that they would hesitate or even switch sides. The march continued along routes chosen not only for strategic reasons but also for their symbolic value. Each mile brought him closer to the heart of the country, and each successful encounter reinforced the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Crowds gathered in larger numbers, sometimes cheering, sometimes watching in stunned silence. The transformation in public reaction reflected the rapid spread of news. Reports of soldiers joining him circulated widely, creating an impression that resistance might be futile. This perception became a powerful force in itself. Commanders of royal troops faced a difficult dilemma. They were ordered to stop the advancing force, yet they could not be certain of their soldiers' loyalty. The risk of defection loomed over every decision. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, he continued to rely on dramatic gestures. Instead of preparing elaborate defensive positions, he moved forward confidently, often placing himself in situations where his personal presence would influence outcomes. His willingness to expose himself to danger added credibility to his appeals. Soldiers who saw him standing calmly before them were reminded of past campaigns, of the leader who had shared hardships and victories. This emotional connection proved difficult to resist. Another encounter approached as royal troops positioned themselves along his path. Tension built as both sides prepared for contact. Once again, the possibility of violence hung in the air. Yet he repeated the strategy that had already succeeded. He advanced ahead of his men, addressing the opposing soldiers directly. His words were not long speeches but concise appeals, invoking shared identity and past loyalty. The effect was immediate. Confusion spread among the ranks of the opposing force. Some soldiers lowered their weapons, others looked to their officers for guidance, and still others began to shout in recognition. The line between the two sides blurred, and gradually soldiers stepped forward to join him. This pattern repeated itself in multiple encounters. Each time, the spectacle of defection strengthened his reputation. The idea that he could win without fighting became widely accepted. Civilians began to interpret his march as inevitable, and this perception further undermined resistance. Officials who might have organized opposition hesitated, fearing that their own troops would abandon them. The restored monarchy, meanwhile, struggled to respond effectively. Messages sent from the capital urged commanders to stand firm, yet those on the ground faced the reality of wavering loyalty. Reports of defections reached the government, increasing anxiety. The advancing column grew not only in numbers but also in confidence. Veterans who joined brought experience and discipline, enhancing the force's capability. The march transformed into a procession that combined military movement with political theater. Each town visited became a stage on which allegiance was tested and often shifted. The emotional dimension of these encounters cannot be overstated. Many soldiers had built their careers under his leadership. They remembered promotions, honors, and shared hardships. Seeing him again stirred memories that outweighed abstract loyalty to a distant monarchy. He capitalized on this sentiment, presenting himself as a familiar figure returning to restore stability. At the same time, he avoided harsh rhetoric that might alienate potential supporters. His proclamations emphasized unity and the preservation of achievements from earlier years. This approach reassured civilians who feared renewed conflict. As the march continued, news reached the capital more frequently. Panic began to spread among those in power. The speed of events made it difficult to coordinate a response. Each day brought new reports of troops switching sides. The government attempted to mobilize additional forces, but uncertainty undermined these efforts. Officers questioned whether their men would obey orders. Some commanders withdrew rather than risk confrontation. This hesitation allowed the advancing force to move forward with minimal resistance. The psychological advantage became overwhelming. The image of a leader returning from exile and regaining support without battle captured public imagination. Newspapers and messengers spread stories that enhanced the sense of drama. Villagers lined the roads, cheering as the column passed. The growing crowd reinforced the perception of legitimacy. Even those who remained skeptical could not ignore the momentum. As the distance to the capital shortened, the stakes increased. The possibility of a decisive confrontation remained, but the pattern of persuasion continued. Another royal force positioned itself along the route, and once again tension rose. The outcome followed the now familiar pattern. He approached, spoke, and watched as hesitation turned into support. Officers who might have resisted found themselves isolated as their men joined the advancing column. This process highlighted the importance of morale in military affairs. Orders alone could not compel loyalty when emotional ties pulled in another direction. The march became a demonstration of leadership's intangible power. By the time he approached major urban centers, the atmosphere resembled celebration more than campaign. Crowds gathered in large numbers, welcoming him as though he had already regained authority. Local officials, unsure of their position, often chose accommodation. The restored monarchy's influence weakened rapidly. The king and his advisors, confronted with the rapid shift, debated options. Some urged negotiation, others recommended withdrawal. The speed of events left little time for decisive action. Meanwhile, the advancing force continued to grow. Each new unit that joined brought additional credibility. The transformation from small expedition to national movement was nearly complete. The final approach to the capital unfolded with dramatic intensity. The possibility of resistance diminished as reports confirmed that troops near the city were also wavering. The king, recognizing the danger, decided to leave rather than risk capture. This decision effectively removed organized opposition. When the returning leader entered the capital, he did so without major conflict. Crowds filled the streets, cheering and observing the extraordinary turn of events. The emperor, once exiled and presumed finished, had returned to power through a campaign defined not by battles, but by persuasion and psychological insight. The success of this phase demonstrated that leadership, reputation, and timing could reshape political reality. The journey from the coast to the capital, accomplished in a matter of weeks, became one of history's most remarkable examples of winning without fighting. The return to the capital marked the beginning of a new and uncertain phase. The dramatic march from the southern coast had succeeded beyond expectations, and the former exile now found himself once again at the center of power. Crowds filled the streets, soldiers pledged loyalty, and officials hurried to adjust to the rapidly changing reality. Yet beneath the celebration lay an awareness that the situation remained fragile. The restored monarchy had collapsed quickly, but the international reaction was inevitable. Across Europe, rulers who had only recently agreed on a settlement now faced the shocking news that the man they had exiled had returned and reclaimed authority. The period that followed became known as the 100 Days, a brief but intense chapter filled with urgency, preparation, and looming confrontation. The returning leader understood that his position depended on time. Every day counted. He needed to consolidate authority, reassure the population, reorganize the army, and prepare for the response of foreign powers. The government was re-established with remarkable speed. Former officials returned to their posts, new appointments were made, and proclamations were issued emphasizing stability and continuity. He aimed to present his return not as a revolution but as a restoration of order. Promises of reform and constitutional governance were announced, designed to attract moderate support and reduce fears of renewed authoritarianism. These measures reflected his recognition that public opinion mattered. He sought to balance the image of strong leadership with assurances of legality and representation. Meanwhile, the army required immediate attention. Units that had joined during the march needed organization, and additional troops had to be mobilized. Veterans responded to calls for service, and recruitment accelerated. Equipment, supplies, and training became priorities. The logistical challenge was immense, but urgency drove rapid progress. Workshops produced uniforms and weapons, while officers re-established command structures. The atmosphere in the capital mixed enthusiasm with tension. Citizens celebrated the dramatic return, yet many understood that peace might not last. Diplomatic messages from abroad confirmed their fears. The powers of Europe declared him an outlaw, refusing to recognize his authority. They began mobilizing armies, determined to end the renewed threat. This reaction placed him in a difficult position. He could not wait passively for enemies to invade, because delay would allow them to gather overwhelming strength. He needed a strategy that would exploit speed and initiative. His plan centered on striking first. By moving quickly into neighboring territory, he hoped to defeat opposing forces separately before they could unite. This approach reflected principles that had guided his earlier campaigns. He believed that decisive action and concentration of force could offset numerical disadvantage. Preparations intensified. Maps were studied, routes planned, and intelligence gathered. The target area lay to the north, where enemy armies were assembling. He intended to cross the frontier and engage them before reinforcements arrived. The decision carried significant risk. Failure would expose his army to counterattack and undermine support at home. Success, however, might secure his position and force negotiations. As June approached, the army marched toward the frontier. Soldiers moved with determination, aware that the coming battle would decide the future. The weather, terrain, and timing all influenced the campaign. Initial maneuvers appeared promising. He advanced rapidly, surprising opponents and disrupting their plans. Early engagements demonstrated the skill of his commanders and the morale of his troops. Yet challenges soon emerged. Coordination among different units proved difficult, and communication delays complicated operations. Rain fell heavily, turning roads into mud and slowing movement. These factors, seemingly minor, accumulated into significant obstacles. The opposing forces, though initially surprised, began to regroup. Reinforcements approached, and their commanders prepared defensive positions. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation near a small village that would become famous. The battlefield conditions were far from ideal. Wet ground delayed artillery deployment, and timing became critical. He planned to attack with precision, but delays allowed the enemy to strengthen their lines. The battle unfolded with intensity. Infantry advanced, cavalry charged, and artillery thundered. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Some attacks achieved temporary success, pushing back opposing troops. Yet resistance stiffened and reinforcements continued to arrive. The arrival of additional enemy forces shifted the balance. The battlefield became chaotic, with units struggling to maintain formation. Despite attempts to rally his troops, momentum slipped away. By evening, exhaustion and pressure combined to break cohesion. Retreat began, first gradually, then rapidly. The defeat was decisive. The army, though brave, could not recover. News of the loss spread quickly, and its impact was immediate. Support that had grown during the return began to waver. Political leaders recognized that continued resistance might lead to occupation and devastation. He returned to the capital, confronting the reality that his second reign had reached its end. The 100 days, filled with hope and urgency, concluded in defeat. Abdication followed once more, this time final. The brief restoration had demonstrated both his enduring influence and the limits of ambition in the face of united opposition. The aftermath of defeat unfolded with a sense of inevitability that contrasted sharply with the dramatic momentum of the earlier return. The army, once confident and energized, retreated in disorder, and the news spread rapidly across the country. The capital, which only weeks earlier had celebrated the astonishing restoration, now faced uncertainty and fear. Political leaders gathered, debating options, aware that foreign armies would soon advance. The returning ruler, confronted with the consequences of the failed campaign, recognized that resistance could lead to further destruction. He still possessed personal authority and loyal supporters, but the balance of power had shifted decisively. The coalition opposing him was vast, determined, and now united by the recent victory. In these circumstances he made the decision to abdicate once more. The act, though familiar, carried a finality that had not existed before. The dramatic return from exile had been bold, but the defeat left little room for another attempt. The political atmosphere reflected exhaustion. Years of conflict had drained resources, and many feared renewed war. Abdication appeared as the only path to avoid further bloodshed. Once he stepped down, attention turned to his fate. The leaders of Europe, remembering the earlier exile that had failed to contain him, resolved not to repeat the same mistake. They sought a location so remote that escape would be nearly impossible. The chosen destination lay far from continental shores, a small island in the South Atlantic, isolated by vast distances of ocean. The journey there symbolized the end of his active role in European politics. As he departed, the contrast between past glory and present reality became stark. He had once traveled at the head of armies, welcomed by crowds, and now he sailed under guard toward a distant exile. The voyage itself offered time for reflection. Observers noted that he remained composed, occasionally discussing past campaigns and decisions. The island that awaited him was rugged and remote, with limited population and harsh conditions. Unlike his previous exile, it offered no proximity to the centers of power. The isolation was deliberate. Upon arrival, he settled into a routine shaped by confinement and introspection. He walked, read, dictated memoirs, and conversed with companions. These conversations often returned to earlier events, analyzing strategies and outcomes. He sought to shape the narrative of his life, emphasizing achievements and explaining failures. The writing of memoirs became an important activity, allowing him to influence how history would remember him. Visitors occasionally arrived, bringing news from Europe. Though he remained interested in developments, he no longer possessed the means to intervene. The distance ensured that his influence gradually diminished, yet his legend persisted. Stories of the daring escape, the march without battles, and the dramatic return circulated widely. Even opponents acknowledged the audacity of the attempt. Historians later debated whether the escape represented reckless ambition or remarkable courage. Regardless of interpretation, the episode captured imagination. The image of a leader leaving a small island, gathering support, and reclaiming power resonated as a symbol of determination. His final years passed quietly compared to the tumult of earlier life. Health declined, and the harsh climate affected him. Surrounded by a small circle of loyal followers, he reflected on the arc of his career. He had risen from modest origins to dominate Europe, fallen, returned, and fallen again. The pattern illustrated both the possibilities and limits of ambition. When he died, news traveled slowly but produced widespread reaction. Supporters mourned, critics reflected, and historians began assessing his legacy. The escape from exile remained a defining moment, representing the power of confidence and timing. It demonstrated that leadership could inspire loyalty even after defeat, yet the final defeat also underscored the importance of broader political forces. No individual, however determined, could indefinitely overcome united opposition. The story concluded not with triumph but with reflection. The fallen emperor's last years on a remote island symbolized the end of an era. His escape, however, continued to fascinate, illustrating how history sometimes turns on daring decisions. The memory of the brief return, the march without battles, and the dramatic rise and fall became part of the larger narrative of European transformation. The story of the daring escape and the subsequent return, though concluded in its immediate political consequences, left a legacy that extended far beyond the events themselves. The implications of the escape reverberated across Europe, affecting not only military and political developments, but also the perception of leadership, ambition, and human resilience. The man who had risen from modest origins to dominate the continent had demonstrated that audacity, intelligence, and charisma could momentarily overcome limitations imposed by circumstance. His escape from exile on Elba and the subsequent march to the capital remained a testament to the power of reputation and the psychological impact of leadership. Scholars and military theorists examined the campaign extensively, noting that it exemplified the influence of morale, loyalty, and perception over purely numerical advantage. The ability to inspire devotion among soldiers who had previously served under him, combined with the careful management of public sentiment, created a force that exceeded its size. Observers marveled at the strategic elegance of achieving momentum without engaging in conventional battles. While conventional military theory emphasized supply lines, fortifications, and troop strength, this episode highlighted the importance of timing, surprise, and symbolic authority. Historians debated the broader implications for governance and political power, observing that the episode illustrated the tenuous nature of imposed settlements. The coalition powers had assumed that removing a leader from the physical center of power would neutralize his influence. They underestimated the continuing effects of charisma, loyalty, and the perception of legitimacy among both soldiers and civilians. The escape demonstrated that a leader's influence could transcend physical confinement, provided that conditions allowed for the rapid exploitation of opportunity. Beyond the immediate military and political consequences, the escape influenced the cultural imagination of Europe. Writers, artists, and philosophers drew inspiration from the audacity and dramatic timing of the events. The notion of a powerful figure defying the constraints of exile, reclaiming authority through courage and determination, became emblematic of human potential and the capacity for extraordinary action. Literary works of the period often reference the narrative, presenting it as a story of resilience, strategic genius, and the tension between fate and choice. The symbolic dimension of the escape contributed to its enduring fascination. It was not merely a military maneuver or political gambit. It became a story about the human spirit, the possibilities of leadership, and the interplay between chance and planning. Even as contemporaries debated the morality or recklessness of the action, few could deny the sheer audacity of the attempt. On a more personal level, the experience of exile and escape had profound effects on the leader himself. Years of confinement on Elba had offered time for reflection, planning, and introspection. He had confronted the limitations of circumstance, the fragility of alliances, and the weight of reputation. The decision to escape represented both an embrace of risk and a demonstration of self-confidence. By acting decisively, he transformed a situation that could have led to permanent obscurity into an episode of temporary resurgence. The psychological aspects of the campaign became a subject of study. His ability to read the morale of troops, assess the disposition of civilians, and anticipate the reactions of opponents allowed him to navigate complex social and political dynamics with precision. The return to power, even if brief, revealed the potency of personal influence and the way perception can alter objective circumstances. The interplay between expectation and action was critical. Soldiers and civilians had been conditioned to believe in his capabilities. By moving quickly and demonstrating confidence, he activated that perception, turning belief into practical advantage. Analysts emphasize that his success relied on understanding human behavior as much as military tactics. The broader European response highlighted the challenges of coalition politics. The powers that had exiled him were forced to recognize that temporary measures could be undone by rapid, decisive action. Coordination among multiple nations was difficult, and assumptions of stability could be undermined by underestimated actors. The episode reinforced the idea that political settlements required both enforcement and attention to underlying loyalties and sentiments. In military education, the campaign became a case study in maneuver, initiative, and psychological operations. Officers studied the rapid concentration of loyal forces, the careful selection of routes, and the engagement of opposing troops through persuasion rather than combat. The importance of morale, timing, and reputation was emphasized alongside conventional considerations of supply and formation. The story also prompted reflection on the limits of exile as a tool for containment. While Elba had initially seemed secure, it had failed to prevent action. The later exile to the remote South Atlantic island illustrated a more effective approach, yet it underscored the need for vigilance and foresight when dealing with influential figures. The episode remained a powerful lesson in leadership, illustrating both the potential for bold initiative and the constraints imposed by broader political realities. Even in failure, the dramatic escape and return enhanced his historical reputation. Popular imagination embraced the narrative of audacious action, the march without major battles, and the temporary reclamation of authority. Cultural memory preserved these events in art, literature, and storytelling, ensuring that they became emblematic of determination, strategy, and the human capacity to alter apparent destiny. Beyond individual and cultural impact, the escape influenced subsequent political and military thought. Leaders recognized the need to consider not only physical power but also legitimacy, perception, and loyalty when assessing threats. The episode demonstrated that even small, committed forces could achieve outsized impact if deployed with timing, confidence, and psychological insight. In the decades that followed, the escape was referenced repeatedly as an example of audacity, illustrating the interplay between opportunity, preparation, and action. It shaped discussions of exile, rebellion, and the dynamics of returning to power after displacement. The narrative continued to inspire analysis, debate, and reflection. The enduring fascination lay not only in the sequence of events, but in the broader themes it represented. Human ambition, the power of perception, the tension between risk and reward, and the influence of leadership all converged in this remarkable episode. The escape from exile on Elba and the march to the capital remained a defining moment in the study of history, military strategy, and political psychology. It illustrated that even after apparent defeat, a combination of daring, insight, and timing could momentarily alter the course of events. Yet it also highlighted limits. The ultimate failure of the 100 Days campaign demonstrated that extraordinary personal action, while powerful, could not indefinitely overcome the forces of coordinated opposition, geography, and logistics. The story concluded with both triumph and caution, offering lessons in courage, strategy, and the interaction between individual initiative and collective circumstances. Over time, historians continued to explore the complexities of the episode, emphasizing that the escape and return were not simply acts of luck or bravado, but involved careful observation, planning, and understanding of human behavior. Every stage from exile to landing, from the march to the capital to the brief restoration, illustrated the interplay between preparation, perception, and decisive action. The legacy of the escape extended far beyond immediate political outcomes, shaping how leaders, soldiers, and citizens understood power, loyalty, and the possibilities inherent in bold decision-making. The dramatic events surrounding the escape became a touchstone for discussions about leadership, risk, and the capacity of individuals to influence historical trajectories. They demonstrated that while circumstances may impose constraints, the combination of ambition, strategy, and human psychology can create extraordinary, if temporary, transformations. The final phase of this remarkable story, though often overshadowed by the daring escape and the dramatic march back to the capital, offers profound insights into the nature of legacy, leadership, and the enduring impact of bold action. After the ultimate defeat and the enforced exile to the remote South Atlantic island, life became one of quiet reflection, constrained movement, and gradual awareness of the limits imposed by geography and circumstance. The island, isolated and inhospitable, was a stark contrast to the bustling cities, sprawling battlefields, and grand palaces that had once defined his existence. Yet within this confinement, the former emperor faced the opportunity to observe the world from a distance, to consolidate memories, and to attempt to shape posterity through reflection and writing. The physical isolation created an intellectual space. Surrounded by a small circle of loyal attendants and companions, he was free from the immediate pressures of political maneuvering, yet acutely aware of the scrutiny of the broader world. Letters arrived intermittently, bringing news of European politics, shifts in alliances, and public discourse regarding his legacy. These tidbits of information, fragmented and delayed, provided both relief and frustration. He could no longer act decisively to influence events, but he could analyze them, draw lessons, and plan strategies in theory. During this period, he devoted considerable attention to writing memoirs, dictating reflections on campaigns, governance, and diplomacy. These writings were not merely personal diaries. They were carefully structured narratives aimed at preserving his perspective, explaining decisions, and influencing the historical record. He analyzed the logic of his previous military operations, reflecting on victories and defeats alike, noting where boldness had succeeded and where miscalculation or overreach had caused setbacks. This process of introspection allowed him to engage with his past in a manner that combined humility with pride, revealing a complex understanding of strategy, leadership, and human nature. Beyond military reflection, he also considered the political and social transformations he had initiated. Reforms in administration, law, and education were assessed, evaluated for their lasting impact, and defended against criticism. He took care to document achievements in ways that could counteract narratives imposed by adversaries. While the immediate world was beyond his reach, these writings became instruments of influence over time, shaping the perception of historians, politicians, and citizens in generations that followed. Social interaction on the island, though limited, remained vital. He maintained structured routines with his companions, engaging in discussions ranging from philosophy and history to contemporary European developments. These dialogues allowed him to exercise intellectual rigor and to test ideas in the absence of formal political authority. Through careful observation and dialogue, he continued to refine his understanding of governance, human behavior, and the delicate balance between coercion and consent. Physical life on the island imposed its own challenges. The climate, terrain, and scarcity of resources demanded adaptation. Daily routines involved walks, inspections of the immediate environment, and management of the small household. Tasks that were once trivial in imperial surroundings, such as ensuring food supply, sanitation, and shelter, now required attention and organization. These activities, though mundane, allowed him to exercise authority on a microcosmic scale, reinforcing habits of leadership even in constrained circumstances. Health gradually became a concern. Years of relentless activity, stress, and prior injuries accumulated, creating physical limitations that could not be ignored. Yet these constraints did not diminish intellectual engagement or the desire to influence perception. He adapted routines to accommodate weakness, relying more on writing, reading, and discussion. This phase of life underscored the distinction between physical limitation and intellectual or symbolic influence. The broader European context continued to evolve. The powers that had enforced his exile established post-war settlements, adjusted borders, and sought to stabilize regimes threatened by upheaval. His presence on the distant island, though physically removed, remained a symbolic factor. Monarchs, generals, and diplomats all considered the possibility of lingering influence, whether through supporters, public sentiment, or the enduring fascination with his persona. His former admirers, veterans, and political sympathizers remained attentive. Though direct action was impossible, correspondence and the occasional visitor allowed for the maintenance of networks. These networks were modest in scale, yet they reinforced the idea that leadership transcends proximity. Loyalty, perception, and symbolic authority continued to operate even in absence. Cultural interpretation of his life and campaigns flourished during this period. Artists, playwrights, and writers drew inspiration from the escape, the 100 Days, and the ultimate exile. The dramatic tension of leaving Elba, marching without resistance, briefly reclaiming authority, and then facing inevitable defeat provided fertile ground for exploration of ambition, strategy, and the human condition. The story became emblematic of both the heights of audacity and the limits of individual power in the face of collective opposition. In reflection, he considered not only personal achievement but also the broader human and historical lessons. The capacity for decisive action, the importance of timing, and the interplay of perception and loyalty were principles he had observed in the field, now reconsidered with the perspective afforded by isolation and time. He examined how human emotion, memory, and identity shape political realities, understanding that the legacies of leadership extend far beyond the immediate consequences of action. The exile also provided opportunity for introspection regarding mortality and legacy. The distance from the centers of power, combined with reflection on prior victories and defeats, fostered a sense of perspective that emphasized enduring principles over ephemeral gains. He considered how posterity would judge both the triumphs and failures, how history might weigh audacity against recklessness, and how symbolic acts of courage resonate across time. The physical confinement of the island allowed the mind to roam freely. Daily observation of natural phenomena, the sea, the weather, the isolation provided metaphorical frameworks for reflection. The vast distances between the island and Europe mirrored the separation between action and consequence, reinforcing lessons about strategy, patience, and the limits of control. Visitors occasionally brought objects, letters, or news from afar, each item connecting the remote location with the larger world. The exile became, paradoxically, a place of intellectual freedom, where immediate risk was removed but analysis, planning, and reflection could flourish without interruption. Despite the constrained environment, he maintained ceremonial routines, preserving dignity and reinforcing the identity that had sustained him through years of both triumph and adversity. Daily schedules included reading, dictating, walking, and engaging with companions. These routines echoed the structure of previous life, ensuring that discipline, focus, and leadership habits remained intact. In this sense, exile was not mere punishment but an environment that allowed for contemplation, learning, and preparation of thoughts and memoirs that would influence generations. Political developments in Europe continued to confirm the wisdom of caution. The coalition powers established mechanisms to prevent resurgence, maintain borders, and enforce treaties. Yet the enduring fascination with his earlier escape and brief restoration influenced military planning, political discourse, and public sentiment. Monarchs recognized that even absent direct action, the narrative of boldness and audacity shaped the imagination, demonstrating the power of reputation and symbolic authority. The island, while isolated, did not erase the impact of prior action. Soldiers who had participated in the return, citizens who had witnessed events, and observers who chronicled history all carried forward the memory of daring initiative. This memory created a lasting psychological footprint that influenced subsequent generations, shaping both historical interpretation and cultural imagination. In later years, the exiled leader turned increasingly toward intellectual pursuits. Study of history, philosophy, and law consumed attention, providing structure and meaning. He continued to dictate memoirs, emphasizing analysis, context, and reasoning. These writings became not only a personal record but also a source of instruction for future leaders. The reflection on strategy, leadership, and human behavior demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between individual action and collective circumstances. The combination of isolation, reflection, and writing created a unique environment in which personal legacy could be cultivated. Though direct influence on events was no longer possible, the shaping of perception, narrative, and historical record offered a different but significant form of power. Correspondence with visitors, limited advisors, and intermediaries ensured that thoughts and ideas reached Europe, contributing to the enduring fascination with both the escape and the broader career. The physical and psychological discipline maintained during exile underscored the consistency of character. Even in circumstances of ultimate constraint, he retained the capacity for observation, reflection, and influence. The period highlighted the distinction between tangible authority and the intangible power of intellect, reputation, and legacy. Ultimately, the exile, remote and permanent, became a stage for the culmination of thought, reflection, and the shaping of posterity. The story of escape, restoration, defeat, and exile provided a comprehensive illustration of leadership, ambition, strategy, and the human capacity to act decisively under constraint. It emphasized the balance between action and consequence, the interplay of perception and reality, and the enduring significance of reputation and legacy. The lessons extended beyond military or political contexts, offering insight into human determination, resilience, and the complex dynamics of influence that persist even when direct power is removed. The life in exile, characterized by reflection, writing, and intellectual engagement, solidified his place in history as a figure whose daring actions, strategic brilliance, and psychological insight would be studied, debated, and remembered for generations, demonstrating that the impact of leadership can endure long after the individual has been removed from the centers of power, and that the combination of audacity, timing, and understanding of human behavior can create moments that resonate far beyond their immediate consequences, shaping both historical narrative and cultural imagination.